Good evening, I'm David Nicholas. The arguments have come before the nation's highest court, and now Michigan and the nation await the decision on the legality of same-sex marriage. And next on CMU Public Television, we visit with a lawmaker who in 2004 co-authored the voter-approved ban on same-sex marriage that is now being challenged. Representative Gary Glenn returns to Capitol Report.
Welcome to Capitol Report, a weekly discussion with your elected officials on the issues and concerns that affect you.
Currently serving in his first term representing the 98th District, Representative Glenn has been firm in his opposition to same-sex marriage. Representative Glenn, thank you for joining us again here on the program. Good to have you back.
Dave, always a pleasure.
As we sit down today, we're about a week removed from the U.S. Supreme Court taking the oral arguments in the challenge to bans on same-sex marriage that came from Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. We noted that in the open that you were one of the authors of the ballot initiative that banned same-sex marriage in the state. Voters approving that in 2004, and it has stood as the law of the state since then. I wonder if you could give us a sense first of the landscape 11 years ago. This may have been lost somewhat in the debate on this, and what position the state had on the books regarding same-sex marriage then, what was going on in neighboring states in the country, and what prompted you and others to take that issue to the voters 11 years ago.
Well, Michigan has long defined marriage as being only between one man and one woman. We had it in state statute, in state law, prior to 2003, when the Ontario, Canada Supreme Court issued a decision. And our concern at the time was that individuals who lived in Michigan could go across the bridge at Detroit and under the new Canadian ruling could get married, come back over to Michigan, and the ACLU of Michigan would file a lawsuit demanding recognition of that Canadian marriage license. And so we initiated the process of gathering 500,000 signatures, near miraculous that we did it in 12 weeks, to place before Michigan voters a constitutional amendment to put it on our state constitution, defining marriage as only between one man and one woman, which was overwhelmingly approved by Michigan voters. I'm certainly proud to stand alongside Attorney General Bill Schuette in the position and arguments he's made in front of the court just in the last several weeks, upholding the vote of the people. 2.7 million Michigan voters voted to put in our state constitution the definition of marriage for the benefit of society and future generations of children, is what the amendment said. A marriage between one man and one woman shall be the only agreement recognized as a marriage in the state of Michigan.
What is the ruling that the High Court will make in June? And that seems like an oversimplified question, but is there going to be a single decision as the four cases have now been heard, or would we look for any range of interpretation based on the challenges, different issues, different questions that were raised among the four challenges that came from Michigan and the three other states?
Well, Dave, the United States Supreme Court has a history of reaching up into thin air and creating rights that do not appear in the text of the Constitution. So there's no limit. In today's legal culture, there seems to be no limit to what 5 unelected judges, the least accountable branch of our federal government, can do. But supposedly the two questions they're going to ask and answer is there a constitutional right to redefine marriage to mean instead of just a man and a woman, 2 men or 2 women? And if that right does exist, then I wonder in the future what the rational basis is for denying future interest groups their demand to redefine it again, to include polygamy or group marriage. The Marriage Protection Amendment that I helped co-author does not mention the word gay or homosexual or ban. It defines what marriage is between one man and one woman. It does not define what it isn't. So it could just as accurately, because it provides that marriage is only between one man and one woman, could just as accurately be characterized as a ban on redefining marriage to include polygamy. The people of Michigan, 2.7 million voters, about 60% of the vote, by an even higher margin here in our viewing area, voted in favor of that amendment because they judged it to be in the best interests of society and future generations of children to continue to define marriage as we have traditionally between a man and a woman. One of the, I actually am encouraged by the fact that Justice Kennedy, in his questioning, acknowledged that it would be very difficult for the court to just arbitrarily announce that 5 members or more of the Supreme Court know better than 2.7 million Michigan voters. If the court is consistent with two very recent decisions just in the last 3 or 4 years, then there is some hope that they will in fact uphold the vote of the 2.7 million Michigan voters who supported that amendment. They ruled in the Defense of Marriage Act case just 2 or 3 years ago. Now, the Defense of Marriage Act was passed overwhelmingly in Congress, was signed into law by President Clinton, that established a federal definition of marriage as only between a man and a woman. And just 2 or 3 years ago, the United States Supreme Court overturned the federal definition of marriage, and the very basis on which they did so, Dave, was saying that it has historically been the authority and purview of the states to define what a marriage is and what it isn't. Then in the University of Michigan affirmative action case, even more recently, they ruled that the federal judiciary should have great deference and respect for actual votes of the people on the ballot. And I think it was Justice Kennedy who authored that decision, said it would be demeaning to democracy to suggest that any issue, in that case it was affirmative action, but to suggest that any issue is so complex or so controversial that the people themselves are not capable of investigating, considering, and issuing a rational decision, as they did both in the affirmative action case and in the case of the Marriage Protection Amendment by about a 60% margin of the people of Michigan.
What about the language from Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee? How familiar are you with those? You referred earlier to the latitude that the court will sometimes take in an interpretation, and we don't have a single challenge here. We have four. So what likely could come in? I mean, if it was the Michigan case solely, I think you've defined that as to how you would anticipate or see the court ruling on that. But what about now the fact that we're hearing or have heard 4 cases at once?
Well, the Michigan case is the one on which they're supposed to answer the question of whether or not there's a constitutional right to redefine marriage. Under the 14th Amendment, I in fact think there is no 14th Amendment question, because the current law that defines marriage as only being between a man and a woman applies equally to every American. Every American, within limitations, can marry someone of the opposite sex. So there is an equal application of the law as marriage is currently defined. And one of the things the court heard in testimony last week, which no one disputed on either side, is that before 2001, there was no civilization, no society in the history of mankind that had ever defined marriage as anything other than between males and females, men and women. The other 3 amendments at the state level that are before the court are supposed to be to answer the question, should a state have to recognize something that's recognized in another state? So those are the 2 questions. Whether or not, first of all, if there is a constitutional right to redefine marriage. Number 2, should a state have to, let's say that the court rules there is no 50-state constitutional right to redefine marriage. The second question then is a state like Michigan that does not, because of our constitutional provision, recognize marriage as anything other than between a man and a woman, even if it's consummated or legal in some other state, should we be forced as a state to recognize something that's not legal in Michigan but is in some other state?
Civil unions, then, this has been at the heart of, and on this road where states have legalized same-sex marriage. There has been sort of the step where there have been civil unions that are acknowledged. Is there an opportunity where in the current climate where both may stand alongside each other in terms of equal civil rights protection? Because those that have been supporting the move to legalize same-sex marriage have said it is a question of civil rights. You're raising the question quite clearly in terms of a constitutional right. Where might we see, or could we see, some sort of balance or standing that would allow both?
Well, whether or not our founders intended it to be the case, in today's legal culture, it seems as if the United States Supreme Court, no matter what 30 ballot votes by the people of this country in terms of putting marriage protection amendments in their state constitutions, no matter what the Congress of the United States does or what the President does, it seems that in our current legal environment, we have this notion that 5 unelected judges can dictate to the legislative branch, to the executive branch of the federal government, and to all 50 state legislatures and to the people of this country. I don't think that's what our founding fathers intended. If you look at Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, Mr. Lincoln, who was in fact an attorney, said if we ever got to the point where the United States Supreme Court issued a decision and it applied to everybody in the country in all states all at once, he said, we no longer have a free country. We've turned it over to that eminent tribunal, as he said, or 5 members of that eminent tribunal that make up the majority. So could they legalize civil unions and stop short of declaring a constitutional right to redefine marriage? Of course they could. Those who are demanding that we redefine marriage consider that to be a separate but equal policy, and so they do not accept that. Michigan's Marriage Protection Amendment protects the institution of marriage, not just the use of the word marriage. And so Michigan's constitutional amendment in fact says the only agreement that will be recognized as a marriage or similar union is a marriage between a man and a woman. Simply because the people of Michigan looked at this issue 11 years ago and judged that in the best interests of society and future generations of children, we should continue to uphold as a role model relationship marriage between a man and a woman. Every social science study ever done shows that the healthiest, safest, most prosperous environment for a child to be raised is to be raised by a mother and a father who are united with each other and committed to the children through the institution of marriage. And that was a very rational decision. I know that in co-authoring the amendment, that was the rational judgment that Pat Gillen, a law professor, and I made. And I'm convinced that the people of Michigan, 2.7 million of them, were not only capable of, but did rationally look at this issue and achieve the rational decision of about a 60% majority that marriage between a man and a woman is what's best for our society. I'm hopeful the United States Supreme Court will do as it said should be the case in both the Windsor case regarding the Defense of Marriage Act and the University of Michigan affirmative action case, that they leave it to the states to define what marriage is and what it isn't, and that they give great respect and deference to an actual vote of the people, not their elected officials, but a vote of the people of Michigan on the ballot in 2004.
Running alongside this, almost parallel with the run-up to these arguments being heard, the legislature, and most notably in Indiana, but now the legislature here in Michigan also acting or working on measures that would exempt faith-based adoption agencies from working with same-sex couples, a possible move towards a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, here in Michigan, similar to that which was passed and revised in Indiana. Some local governments have or are working to pass LGBT non-discrimination clauses in municipalities. Then how do these potentially balance out, in your view, alongside potentially the pending ruling, we should say, from the High Court?
I think those are some separate issues, but to respond, for example, to one of them that you mentioned, the adoption legislation has passed the House of Representatives here in Michigan on a bipartisan basis, fairly overwhelming vote with both Republican and Democratic sponsors. And I'm going to offer a completely different view, of course, than those who are opposed to this legislation. It would be, as I understand constitutional law, a clear violation of the Constitution and the constitutional rights of, say, Catholic charities if you were to deny them the opportunity to continue to provide adoption referral services to state and local governments on the basis of their religious convictions. That would be a clear case of content discrimination. To say that we're going to seek the services of all agencies who are willing to provide adoption referral services, but then to say to Catholic charities or to the Bethany Baptist referral service and any number of others, Lutheran social services, to say to them that while we're going to seek this from every agency that's available, we're going to deny you the opportunity to participate specifically because of your religious convictions. That would be a clear violation of constitutional law, because that would be a very clear example of content discrimination, which is a clearly established principle in constitutional law. You cannot deny someone the opportunity that others have just because of their religious convictions. So if Catholic Charities chooses, as it does, to refer children for adoption only to married mothers and fathers, because they judge that to be in the best interest of the child, they only make up a small percentage of all the adoption agencies that are available in the state of Michigan. So unless you've got an axe to grind or a point to prove, and you want to use the federal court system to do that, or our state court system, there are plenty of opportunities, plenty of other adoption agencies available to anybody who wants to go seek the opportunity to adopt a child. So I voted in favor of that legislation. I think all but one Republican in the entire legislature, at least the House, voted in favor of it. We had Democratic co-sponsors of that legislation, and so that's already passed. So I think that's perhaps unrelated to what the federal court has before it right now, but we do need to protect the constitutional rights of people of faith, and at the same time, provide every opportunity for others to go look for an agency that is not faith-based to be able to get the services that they want.
You are the Vice Chair of the House Energy Policy Committee, and as the state is working on a rewrite of policy, you're supporting opening the market to increase choice or competition. Is the state moving to then potentially a revised portfolio standard that we've seen the state meet the 10% mark during this year? And what might the grid look like, or a role will longstanding energy providers have in the future?
Well, there are a lot of different issues that are going to be decided by this rewrite of our energy policy. First and foremost, and the one that's gotten the most attention so far, is from 2000 to 2008, Michigan had a completely open market. People were free, residential, commercial, and industrial, to buy their electricity from any provider they wanted. It can be consumers in our viewing area, or DTE down in the Detroit area, or anybody else, an alternative energy supplier who was willing to go to the market and persuade people that they could provide a better product at a better price. In 2008, the utilities argued that unless they had some guaranteed percentage of the marketplace, they couldn't make sufficient calculations for investment in new energy production capacity. So in 2008, 90% of the energy market in Michigan on electricity was given to DTE and consumers. And in fact, no new additional power plants have been constructed. Those same utilities are back in front of us now arguing that they need 100% of the market, that there should be no competition in order for them to be able to invest long-term in building new gas-fired plants, which is the direction that everybody's heading right now, is gas plants in response to the EPA regulations regarding mercury and carbon emissions. I'm skeptical of that approach. We have right next door to us the state of Ohio, which still has a completely open, competitive market where all of the providers of electricity have to compete against each other. And right now you have 6 new plants, either in construction already or in the permitting process in the state of Ohio. And they have cheaper energy rates. You know, we know, Dave, that the concept of having multiple providers of any good or product or service who are offering that to the market, and then the consumer is free to choose whichever one he or she believes is the best deal for them and their families or their business, that you tend to get the best product at the best price. And there's that competition, it drives down the price. Michigan has the 11th highest electricity rates in the nation. We have the highest in the Midwest. We haven't built any new plant in decades. And we have a neighboring state in Ohio that is a free market, open choice competition state where 6 plants are in the process of being constructed or permitted. I've been a vice chairman of the Energy Committee for the last 4 months. I've been in the legislature for 4 months, and that entire time the energy question has been cast under the premise, the narrative, that we are facing some sort of energy crisis because of the EPA regulations. Well, first of all, the EPA regulations may or may not actually go into effect. The Republican U.S. Senate is trying to block them. But even in the worst case scenario, if all of these 9 coal-fired plants in Michigan close down, as the TV commercials tell us will happen, the worst case scenario, Dave, is not that we have a shortage of electricity. And I've learned you got to be very precise in the language you use when discussing a very complex issue. But when people talk about a shortfall, they're talking about the fact that Michigan and all other states, you're required to have enough electricity capacity to keep everybody's lights on, plus 15% in a reserve capacity on top of that. So that on the warmest day in August, when everybody's got their air conditioning on, that even on the peak day, you're still able to keep everybody's lights and air conditioning going. In the worst case scenario that's being framed by TV ads and others, is if all those 9 coal-fired plants shut down, we go from a 15% reserve margin to a 13% reserve margin. And that's the supposed calamity. That means you'd go from 1 day in 10 years when you might not have your electricity available to you to 4 days in 10 years. I don't think that's the great calamity that is being portrayed to us. I don't think it justifies returning 100% of a market on a monopoly system back to consumers and DTE. Let me tell you something that came out in testimony before the Energy Committee that I don't think anybody knew prior to the testimony by the business agent of the Clarkston School District, who said that the school district saves $350,000 a year by being able to buy electricity from somebody other than DTE down in the Clarkston area, and that if they were forced to go back to DTE and lose the 20 to 30% savings they get from buying energy somewhere else, they'd have to lay off 5 teachers. We found out since that about 60% of all the public school districts in Michigan, if you don't count the charter schools, if you count the charter schools, it's about 30%. If you don't count the charters, it's about 60% of all the traditional districts are buying their electricity from somebody else. I'm going to introduce legislation, and I have a Democratic co-sponsor from Detroit that'll say that all our public school systems are free to buy their electricity from some provider other than consumers and DTE. That'll save our school districts millions of dollars. The prisons would save $3 million a year if they were able to buy their electricity from an alternative source. People say, what about hospitals? What about the state and all their political subdivisions, our counties and cities and all public buildings? I'm open to all of that. I don't think the legislation to eliminate choice at all is going to become law. Unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion that a bill to just lift the cap and let everybody be free to choose again, I'm skeptical as to whether that could become law either. But I do think that what we can do is make sure that, for example, in those instances when we can save taxpayers' dollars by allowing our school districts, our prisons, and perhaps state and local government buildings to access choice, that's a good thing for the people of Michigan. And eventually work our way one piece at a time back toward a completely free and open market.
About 3 minutes left. I did want to ask also about the session, the legislation you've introduced in this session that would eliminate the prevailing wage requirements in the construction of public school projects. You said that the projected savings could be more than $220 million. The status currently of those 2 bills?
Well, that bill that I have introduced is one that would eliminate the prevailing wage for school construction only. It has 25 co-sponsors, and it will move its way through the legislative process. There's also a bill in both the House and the Senate to eliminate the prevailing wage requirement on all public construction projects. That's estimated to save us $400 million a year, like on road construction. That is the highest priority of the State Senate and the State House of Representatives. Everything has been waiting on the outcome of the May 5th ballot measure, which by now we know what happened. As you and I are recording this today, we don't yet know what was going to happen. But that's just an example of a place where we could save as much as $400 million and potentially divert some of that savings to road construction, which is one of the reasons that I know for sure how I voted last week, and that is I voted against the biggest tax increase in half a century in Michigan that would have allocated 40% of all the money of the $2.1 billion raised to something other than road construction. I voted against that. And this is one good example because there are places that we can save hundreds of millions of dollars for the taxpayer, let schools be free to buy their energy somewhere else, remove the requirement that we have to pay union scale wage on school and other construction projects, turn it back to the open bidding process, and let the most qualified bidder at the lowest price construct our public buildings. All of these are ways that we can save taxpayers money and divert that money to fixing our roads, since everybody seems to agree that is one of our highest priorities.
In our final minute then, as quickly as we can sum this up, it is, as you said, the eve of the vote. So by the time folks join us for the conversation, that outcome is known. What then potentially is the plan B should Prop 1 go down?
Well, there are any number of other plans. I have reintroduced a bill that actually passed the House of Representatives in the last legislative session, introduced by Speaker of the House Jace Bolger at the time, and it has the virtue of having already passed one of the houses, the State House of Representatives. So that'll be on the table, waiting for action, along with several other possible options. I'd hope that the State House would pass that one again, or at least be open to looking at it. I'm certainly open to amending it. And then hopefully the State Senate would concur, and hopefully I'm confident we can come up with a package, put it on the governor's desk that will divert money to fixing our roads, to keeping our kids and school buses safe. And I'm confident the governor would sign that into law if we can get it to his desk.
By the time all these things catch up, we will know, and we will certainly then also be waiting for the decision of the Supreme Court come June on the ballot proposal and then the challenge to same-sex marriage as well. Busy times ahead, certainly, and we didn't even get to the state of the overall budget. Another conversation for another time, but thanks so much for taking the time again to join us.
Dave. Thank you.
And thank you for your time and attention as well here on Capitol Report. We've been speaking again with Representative Gary Glenn, Republican from Midland, who represents the 98th District. Remember, this program does air this coming Saturday at 6:30 and 1 week from today at 5 in the morning as well in our overnight rotation of programs on CMU Public TV. Also posted to our website. Go to WCMU.org, click on the TV button, the local productions, and you'll find the link there to Capitol Report. We'll wrap up our 2015 season next week on the program with a discussion with Senators Boer and Casperson regarding land management in central and northern Michigan. Hope you'll join us then. We'll talk again soon. Thanks.
You've been watching Capitol Report. Join us again as your elected officials speak to your concerns on current issues.